Oh! Hello. It's the 4th week in the 5th episode of Road to MSI 2022. This is Vision Denial. I'm Sam. For those who are new, I watch every single playoff of every participating region of MSI. Yes, every single one, even that one. Now, last week I had a brief discussion about, right off the bat, about how the LPL had to delay things. So did the PCS due to some stuff that was going on. That was COVID related, just because some of the cases in those regions were starting to ramp up. And so to make sure that everybody was safe, the PCS delayed it by 1 week and the LPL delayed it by 2, which means that I will be able to talk about some PCS stuff or Southeast Asian stuff, but not the LPL this week, despite the fact that they just started again about, I think it was 3 days ago. And for context, this is April 15th that I'm recording this. Otherwise, so far, out of all of the playoff games that have happened so far, we now have 4 qualifying teams, and I'll get to the next 3 that have come up. So we are straight up close to a third of the way through, or just a little bit over a third of the way through, finding all of the teams that will qualify. And yet, we're only about, we're a bit over halfway through everything. This particular episode, I'm covering the last 2 series of April 3rd, and then the series from April 4th until April 10th, for 4 of the 5 series of April 10th, the last series of that day being the Evil Geniuses versus FlyQuest of the LCS, which I will not be able to cover. I have not watched it, probably later today after recording this. But as far as in terms of pacing, it'll be covering from April 3rd to April 10th, the last 2 of April 3rd and most of April 10th. Which means I'm currently only about 5 days behind. I'm catching up, which should be fairly easy. Things slow down after many of these days. Some of the things to look forward to. There's a lot of interesting rematches that happen, and a lot of things that, particularly to me, put up some warning signs regarding a lot of how some of the regions approach the game. It feels like a lot of copycat, but I feel like we'll discuss that later, and how some of the regions are preferring red side over blue side. And again, I think this is because of more of a copycat issue. With that, I say there's not much more to add from it. Let's head on to the first series of this episode, which is, I believe, I have my notes correct. Yes, it is. It's our first rematch. So for the first rematch of the series, or for first rematch of the playoff season for spring, is Estral versus R7 or Rainbow 7 from the Latin American LLA. What if I told you the series could be predicted from Game 1? Teams with side selection picks red, as that is their strong side. Team on blue gets an early 1 to 3K lead. Blue side team loses that lead in the mid to late game. Red side team establishes control and finds a large fight to then snowball the late game, and eventually the final fight to win the game. The teams switch, but the blue and red sides still interact the exact same way. As such, this back and forth 5-game series became incredibly predictable and a little disappointing. And I could talk about how Sohan was very invisible, or how Ase kept playing with deficits, that Grell didn't command presence, or Adi was too far forward, how Septid was not enabled enough, or how Lesa didn't lend any advantages of the laning phase during the early game. Bivoy and Seo were both never addressed as players until it was the late game. Mia and Slow were either catching or being caught. Like, either team moving forward will have had a similar effect in the finals, where I don't think either team would have beaten Ase. But we'll see in the finals and another rematch if Estral shores up their draft and macro issues. Next, we head straight to the LCS in North America. We've got Team Liquid versus Evil Geniuses. Red side is king. Team Liquid had a much stronger grasp on how to navigate their win conditions and the late game. Now, I appreciated some of their skirmish setups, and while the sieges and dives were good, vision play was inconsistent outside of a very large lead. Evil Genius, on their parts, underperformed the late game. But once an early game lead gets going, oh boy. I guess that would explain the Game 5 draft out of them then. Too bad they were way too passive at the start. And even if the lead didn't blow up like it did, it was pretty doomed from the inactive early gameplay for, a Renekton Nidalee composition. The whole show really belonged to the bot lane. Hansama and Danny both performed for their teams incredibly when it counted. Even as I see Evil Genius head to the lower bracket, it would not surprise me if they managed to crawl back for the rematch against Team Liquid, either for the semifinals or finals. They had a strong sense of vision play and neutral setups that will go a long way if they are able to play with leads more efficiently and are more consistent in the early game. Next, we'll head straight to the LCO, where we get Order versus Peace. Peace did not show up at the playoffs at all. Appy is arguably the best performer of that team, but even then, this is utterly awful by them. There are moments of good vision play and neutral setups out of the team, but roll for roll, Peace was completely unprepared. So let's talk about Order then, who benefited from Peace's deer-in-the-headlight moments. How good were they at initiating and ballooning leads? It was okay. But the very lackluster approach to neutrals, giving them up frequently, brash and overzealous approach to the lane state or engages. On a different day, they may lose pretty hard from a lot of the, on paper at least, brash mistakes they kept committing. But they got away with it this series as Peace would just not capitalize on any punish. And with it, Order reaped the rewards on the move on to face PGG to see who goes to the finals. Speaking of, our next one is, we stay towards the LCO in in Oceania, where we get Order versus Pentanet GG. And Order have now gone from the absolute lowest rung of the lower bracket and have gotten three zeros to make it to the grand finals. I commend them. They have shown strong draft sense and how to approach their win conditions. The vision is weak, but the game sense has helped them navigate fog of war and vision denial. Their team fight is the best of the region by a long shot, it seems. The only thing is that every team fight has faced them, like every team that's faced them so far, is that they've had this deer in the headlights go. Slow to react, awful approach to team fights, poor draft adaptation. Not entirely their fault, as no matter the side, teams are seeming to remove Evelynn and Zilean as round one bans against Order, which seems to be limiting a lot of options. And given how close the Pentanet GG versus Chiefs series was, I think Order will win the whole thing and be the next reps for the LCO and MSI. You know, having shown excellent macro choices, both proactively and reactively, good draft adaptability, strong flexibility, solid team fights, and decent neutral play, the region seems to have leveled up, but against Order, seems like the region is kind of petrified, which kind of worries me because Order have not shown the greatest approach to the game. Like, it's not terrible. It's alright, but it's not the greatest. We'll just have to see. Next, we're off to the LJL in Japan for Rascal Jesters versus Burning Core. Well, given the pace the last game was going, I was not expecting back-to-back aces in base rushes to end games. Unfortunate for Burning Core, who decided to rush the end instead of getting leads they needed to eventually end the game. Outside of the bizarre ending, I am certain neither team, regardless of who the winner could have been, would have been able to beat Detonation Focus Me. Draft priority is all over the place for both teams, over-prioritizing support picks over jungle ones, when that's where a lot of the early game primarily focused on. Burning Core had way too much focus getting snowballing drafts that required Dice to play way out of his mind. And he did, just not enough to deal with the gap of skill between Sol and Yuhi, or the bizarre map movements the whole team had. As a whole, Rascal Jesters wasn't much of a stronger match, but, you know, they found themselves with weaker vision sometimes, equally bizarre movements, but at any given point, they were making moves to gain advantages on the map more often than Burning Core, while keeping simpler drafts under their belt. Do I think they'll beat, Sengoku Gaming? No. Rascal Jesters performed more consistently with better draft adaptation across the series, and that is enough sometimes. Next, we head to Southeast Asia for the PCS's CBTC Flying Oysters versus J-Team. I thought this was going to be close, but ultimately in JT's favor. Instead, I got 3 games where JT didn't play to their win conditions at all. Lil V rocked the laning phase, but would be unable to play any other phase of the game. Kanye was struggling to keep control of neutrals, and Driver just getting dunked on non-stop. This series is wild, as Koala gets massive number of kills, and the Flying Oysters moves around the map with such ease and finds so many chances to play to their strengths and punish, JT's whole fumbling mess. The Flying Oysters have impressed me 2 series in a row now, and depending how, Paris St-Germain, the Talons play, I may have to reevaluate who I think will be the representatives of the PCS, because The Flying Oysters are improving a lot. Now, my issues still come to the individual movements and the vision being a little lackluster. Some of the plays they pull off won't work in situations where teams are, pulling off similar things but better vision and cleaner map movement. This team is still a lot of fun, flexible, and one of the few to regularly pull off the 1-3-1 and 1-4 compositions without relying on forcing neutral fights. And I'm excited to see how they fare up in the upper bracket semifinals. Should be fun. But we're going to stick to the same region and head to. We've got over here Paris St-Germain versus Deep Cross Gaming, still within the PCS in Southeast Asia. And Paris St-Germain came more prepared with a lot more flexibility and stronger laners in every category. Now, Deep Cross Gaming had some bright moments going for them, some solid vision, some decent flanks, proper allocation of gold to the win conditions. But they were slow when it mattered the most. The execution of their draft just wasn't there. Maybe during the next series in the lower bracket they can adapt and select drafts that enabled Nestia and Cruscata, because they struggled to keep up with Leaky and Hana. Or they struggled to keep up while Leaky and Hana couldn't match the prowess of their counterparts in Hanabi and Juhan. Now, the Talons on their part, Paris St-Germain, played things patiently, cleanly, and with Unified and Hanabi on their backs saying, "Let's go to the winners finals, baby." Now, this wasn't just a matter of them outplaying purely on the individual level. The amount of trust Unified has for his team to make sure the space for him to work is there, or the trust the team has that he'll play up to his DPS moving forward without overstepping, or even how Hanabi is trusted to really create all of that space. The coordination is just so good. Now, I wish the Talons would approach the game with a higher tempo and more opportunity to balloon their leads, but as it is now, this is very solid play. And even with how the Flying Oysters are playing, I still think I prefer the Talons play over them. Well, up next we're going to go to back to the LJL in Japan for Sengoku Gaming versus Rascal Jesters. This is the third reverse sweep done by the two slowest teams I have ever had the displeasure of covering. Displeasure is a little harsh of a word, but this was very slow. Now, I could talk about how both teams played very hesitant, that despite their strong early game approach and vision, that the mid game comes off very slow, and neither team played towards their win condition for the late game. Rascal Jesters playing towards the map better, while Sengoku Gaming find neutrals and skirmishes for their advantages. They both would still hesitate to close anything out, leading to 50-minute games. But then Game 5 happens, and Rascal Jesters are about to be reverse swept, and decide to do double jungle role swap Ino as support Leona, and take a Bard Jinzhao duo jungle with the Ziggs against Jetsakali? No, you're not hearing that wrong. They had Bard, Jinzhao, duo jungle, took Ino, put him into the support role as Leona, and have a Ziggs while Jetsakali is just running amok. Game 5 was the fastest game, and honestly, Rascal Jester. This was incredibly stupid, and I hope this kind of thing changes, as there are pretty solid stuff from this team. Even though I didn't think they were going to win, there's some pretty solid stuff from this team. Given that, Sengoku Gaming didn't fix anything for this series. Nothing at all that would convince me anything other than a 3-0 in favor of Detonation focus me. Fantastic team fighting and solid neutral setup doesn't work if you're hesitant and slow to any approach of any of your win conditions. You got lucky. Either team could have made it to the finals, making zero difference. But you got to face the biggest throw-in draft I have ever seen. Up next, we got a classic of the PCS in Southeast Asia. We've got our J Team versus Beyond Gaming, but a twist. They're in the lower bracket this time and not the upper bracket for the first time they meet. And honestly, I'm pretty disappointed in J Team and slightly impressed by Beyond Gaming. Now, I did not expect the series to get to 5 games, as I expected J Team to seriously fix the issues they had from their first series. Sad to say that wasn't the case, where both teams had a standout player who constantly needed to be enabled to keep the team relevant, Uniboy and Wako. The other side had a player who kept being given options that required a lot of investment, but was playing behind the curve, Lil V and Minji. And because the draft didn't reflect the strengths of either team, it really came down to the late game fights, which would coin flip frequently. That is, until the last game of the series, where both teams seemed to say fuck it and played very simple and easy, something that should have been done on game 1, or at least since game 1. And it started to show the difference in skill and application, as J Team had a solid and easy hand in the success of that game. Now, if J Team looked to return to the way they looked in game 5, stick to simpler compositions and enable Uniboy more often. And, I know you'll get the rematch against, Flying Oysters and a potential shot against, the Talons. Which order that'll be, who knows? But if you do improve it, you'll likely get that chance. Next, we head to the Turkish TCL Finals for Istanbul fastPay Wildcats versus Galatasaray Espor. Congratulations to the Wildcats on being the second team to qualify for MSI. Now, I have to say I'm not surprised at all. Not even the slightest. Galatasaray do have some solid attributes, consistent vision, good sense of their win conditions, strong early gameplay, all of the yummy stuff. The issue arises when they aren't able to translate that into the late game. Now, Galatasaray found themselves flailing about, trying to find picks instead of managing their waves better, or allocating their vision to their split push, or even being proactive during the late game. The Wildcats, on their end, are an incredibly strong team fighting team, with a rocky early and mid game, but incredible wave management and sense on how to use neutrals to bolster both their team fighting and wave management. And while their early and mid game is rough, how they transition from there to the late game is fascinating. It's like watching a switch flip. And there are proactive approaches, trading up constantly, forcing errors out of your opponent. The Wildcats have seriously been impressive. But what sells them is how good they are at team fighting. Again, I can't reiterate this. Which worries me when they get to MSI, where inevitably almost all of the teams that seem to be prospects for there are going to be very good at team fighting. and some way better in the early game, and are just better at ballooning leads on top of it. Now, we haven't seen what it's like for the Wildcats to be behind in the late game, only even during the early mid-game at worst. And since ballooning leads early is not their strong point, a lot of the other prospective teams around the world have shown stronger aptitude for that stage of the game. Hopefully that gets fixed by the time that it happens, because it could become rough for them. But otherwise, we have our second team that's qualified, and I'm excited to see them face off against some of these strong team fighting teams. Up next, we get our second rematch. And what a rematch it is a very good El Clasico of G2 versus Fnatic. I'm not going to lie. What a drastic improvement. Literally from series to series from G2. Now, Fnatic, good job. But honestly, a little slow to adapt to a situation where you could have opted for a scaling composition instead of a brute forcing early game. You know, like, you kept brute forcing the early game, and G2 just had that pegged from the start. Game 3 showed that you could adapt, but by that point, one misexecution and it's over. G2 on their part, on occasions, overzealous, and the vision control is not as solid, but the vision denial and skirmishes are what carry this team hard. I loved watching how Jankos and caPs would find ways to innovate multiple points of entries for a fight, or split up Fnatic to create chaotic scenarios they couldn't keep up with. I do think that this tempo of play is risky when mostly focusing on trying to gain advantages from fights. Any other team that is equal or better will find ways to capitalize on it just as quick. But Fnatic was not one of those teams today. Now, I hope that G2 finds ways to take their early leads and balloon them in a lane or by suffocation, and not just by map pressure. Pressure is fine, but without suffocating the gold or finding ways to generate it, more, you could find yourself in a situation like Game 3 where it was very close. Too close for comfort, especially against a team that navigates it better. Now, if this is the team that shows up for the finals against Rogue, I wouldn't be surprised for another 3-0. Let's just see if caPs keeps up his string of really good adaptations so far. Up next, we go to Brazil for the CBLOL's Red Canids Kalunga versus Furia Esports. What I saw here was a team that had such a strong approach to the early game. 3 laners who were stronger at that approach of their win conditions, and a team better at creating leads for themselves who could not navigate any of it to the mid game or from the mid to late game. Furia showed such a strong potential this series that was mostly thrown away with baffling macro choices, unwillingness to deviate from a 1-4 playstyle that they were not good at all. And also engages that were just not executed properly, or neutrals that were set up to be coin flip more often than they really should have been. I want to say that Red Canids have most of that down pat, but honestly, outside of their 1-3-1 and how they capitalize on mistakes, Red Canids just kept bleeding gold from laning phase on. If it wasn't for the non-stop kills that were being donated, Titan would fall 30 to 40 CS behind, and even more in kills. And Greptar would fall anywhere between 60 to 80 CS behind plus kills. And this would really hinder their ability to approach fights at all. Come the semis against KaBuM, it wouldn't surprise me if they lost 3-0 like they did previously. We'll just have to see how they manage in their rematch for that. Next, we go to North America's LCS with Cloud9 versus Golden Guardians. I must say, if this showed anything, is that Cloud9 are good at playing re-engage and punishing mistakes. Golden Guardians had a strong approach to the early game, some very solid vision control and denial, but they limited their early game approach with the draft they selected, and with it, their macro decisions and what they would opt into for fights just wouldn't match the draft they had set up for themselves. You need to stop selecting mid-game spikes and hyperscaling if you're going to focus on the early game, Golden Guardians. That said, they were more proactive, and I prefer that over the reactive, slow, hesitant Cloud9, who waited for mistakes after mistakes, keeping things way closer than they needed to, and only showing proactivity once the lead had swung so far in their favor. Cloud9 did not recognize their win conditions and showed no hesitation to close out a game when they... Cloud9 did recognize their win condition and showed no hesitation to close out the game when they knew they could. I just worry that since Cloud9 never found a time to actually balloon any leads and only waited for large fights that would go in their favor, if Cloud9 keeps it up, 100 Thieves and Team Liquid are just going to be better at playing against them. And I can't see Cloud9 being good contenders for MSI. Next, we're going to back to the PCS in Southeast Asia, where we got Deep Cross Gaming versus Frank Esports. If I was to describe Frank, I would use words like inexperienced potential. They are strong team fighters with solid understanding of how to play around vision, but don't know how to manage waves or when to execute said fights. Deep Cross Gaming, on their part, play like either the strongest team of the region or the worst team. Just all in one series. I'm kind of surprised how close this was in game 1 and 2. Only for Deep Cross Gaming to get a 15k lead at 22 minutes in game 3 and stomp Frank Esports like this should never have been close at all. So I will ask this. Why aren't you giving Nestea low economy champs more often? Why aren't you enabling Criscata and Leaky more? Why is it you rush through neutrals only to be split during fights? After game 2 being 51 minutes long, I decided on a coin flip. I typed, I give up on either of these teams making it through. And I stand by that. The inconsistency from both teams make it hard for me to see either of these teams beating J-Team, let alone the flying Oysters or the Talons. Hopefully they can prove me wrong and show something interesting and more consistent in terms of their approaches to the draft that match their playstyle. But I have my doubts. Reasonably. Next, we head to a finals that also doubles as a rematch. We head to the LJL Japanese finals for Detonation Focus Me versus Sengoku Gaming. Rematch and finals. Nice, I love these. These are so good. Usually. So congratulations on Detonation Focus Me being the third team to qualify for MSI. That said, I'm not surprised they won. I'm just more surprised it took 5 games to do it. Sengoku Gaming, you have a lot going for you, at least within this game. Some solid vision control and denial, excellent sense of neutral setup, good idea of what your win conditions are, but the execution is always what gets you, which is why I was floored to see you weigh in game 1. Absolutely floored. Thinking, is this another DFM finals choke? For those of you who are not familiar, Detonation Focus Me is memed on for being chokers in the finals. That they're the strongest team up until playoffs happen, and then they just throw it away. And then Sengoku Gaming wins game 4. Detonation Focus Me fans sweat. But game 5 showed exactly what was up. Jet, your MVP of the series, of your playoffs, when it really counted, forgets to press Zhonya's twice. Now at first, it may not seem that big, but given how often he would save the plays that Sengoku Gaming would start or turn around engages onto them, you wouldn't be surprised how bad that was. Without him around, really rough. Now, on Detonation Focus Me, who by all accounts still had roll for roll the strongest lineup. That said, weird map movements, inconsistent vision play, occasional hesitation around neutrals, which was really weird, were all punished and abused by Sengoku Gaming when they had the chance. And since the ballooning of leads was not something I saw very often out of Detonation Focus Me, it would not surprise me to see them struggle against teams who are significantly better at early game approach or who are better at weathering and punishing mistakes. But if we see an improvement, especially for vision, then this team is a force to be reckoned with. They're very flexible draft with 3 lanes they can carry through. I have some hopes for the LJL reps who keep showing improvement year after year, but only if they fix some of their hesitations. Next, we head to another finals. To Europe, to the LEC Finals for G2 versus Rogue. Congratulations to G2 on being the 4th team to qualify for MSI. I have to say, after the Fnatic versus G2 series, I didn't think G2 could do it. But then their rematch, there was a real chance so long as caPs stayed stable. And well, here we are. caPs and Jankos showing incredible restraint and control of each skirmish they were presented with. Incredible neutral setups. And one of the best, if not the best so far, execution of a 1-4 draft I have seen. So far, at least. Very good. Solid. That said, it was dicey for game 3 where Malrong had started to pop off very hard in the early game, in which I have to say, guys, this is the second time we had to wait until game 3 for anyone on Rogue to start showing some level of proactivity and willingness to play their draft. I'm here wondering, if this was game 1 and not game 3, would Rogue be turning around for a 3-1 score? Because they do play with stronger vision and have shown stronger execution of their early game drafts. Just unfortunately, G2 are just more consistent, played with stronger wave manipulation, better neutral setup, and significantly stronger team fighting on top of their draft setups to enable their play just so much better. This team is a strong contender to challenge the favorites in T1, especially if they keep their momentum. They had 4 3-0 scores in the playoffs. after, if I go back specifically, what was the score again? Yeah, especially after they had lost 3-1 on their entrance in their first series, and they go 4 series 3-0. They're 13-3 within this playoffs. Absolutely crazy. If they keep up this pace, strong contenders for the MSI title. Not guaranteed. I'm still not convinced that they'll beat T1, but very strong contenders. Next, for our last series of the video, we go to another rematch. To the CBLOL in Brazil, where we got the Red Canids Kalunga versus KaBuM Esports. It's rare to see the rematch go in the other direction, usually. But usually, it's done in ways that show some level of improvement from one side. And while both teams are still showing issues regarding their neutral objective approach, inconsistent vision, and bizarre map movements, Red Canids goes the extra mile in showing to decide on simpler drafts that match their playstyle and allow them a lot more room to approach said neutral setups, vision play, and map movements way more efficiently. Oh my god, it's not hard, guys. Just pick simpler. It's so much easier. It honestly worked, as oftentimes I would see an incredible play with vision denial to gain an angle on Baron, and where KaBuM would overcommit on the objective. Red chose to turn because they have the tools to do so. Now, I don't know if they'll fare well against Pain Gaming in the finals, who have looked incredibly dominant for the region. But the slow improvement is noted out of Red Canids, and I'm excited to see what they show. Shout out specifically to Titan, who manages to keep finding angles to win a team fight. Just don't overstep by blowing any unnecessary flashes. It happened once or twice, but don't make a habit of it. With that, my thoughts on the week. There's a lot more rematches that I saw this year that ended up going in favor of the losing team from the first series going into the second one. A lot of times, losers brackets are used to help solidify and guarantee a team has a better chance of proving that they were probably the ones to go forward, but it's rare that it actually turns out that way. And we got 2 series in which that did happen, we got 2 series in which that did happen, which is a lot more like a 50% times that happens is rare, at least in the history of the losers bracket in League of Legends. Which then leads me to the teams that did win their losers bracket rematch were teams that played easier to execute team fighting compositions. I remember last week discussing about the reason why a lot of teams are doing dive or re-engage compositions has to do with a lot of the power picks, or that seems to be the preference of what's going on. And I'm very surprised why more teams are not using zoning long-range engage compositions. The fact that I don't see Ornn being picked up as often, or a combination of making sure to remove Braum or baiting it out, is not as often used as a tool as I think it should be used. Or the fact that not enough priority is put onto Volibear for some of the regions. Some games I'm watching Volibear go by, just not considered at all. And I'm wondering here, what's going on? Why such a reliance or such a unwillingness to go for some of these simpler compositions that seem to have a higher success rate than your 1-4s, your 1-3-1s, your sieging compositions that require such a high level of execution that when falling behind have zero tools to help start and engage to get back into the game. I'm left baffled by that whole situation. And then this leads me to, and speaking of draft specifically, this leads me to the second thing, the whole not the new wave, but the wave of like red side becoming more and more prevalent in terms of victories. And how teams are not navigating what I would believe are what I would say is like draft priorities. Because the red side seems to be getting more and more favored because they have a lot more abilities to create counter picks in ways that are unnoticeable. Things like not banning a lot of the power picks that are relevant, forcing your opponents to pick one of 3 choices, so they pick one and you get 2. A thing that I don't think is being discussed by a lot of the shoutcasters across the regions. Or how the red side round 2 bans allows a lot more availability to be able to like have the same kind of power that blue side first pick has, whilst still having the counter pick after you see their entire draft. And a lot of that power is great if it's used properly. And by all accounts, a lot of these teams don't seem to be using either side to their greatest strength for coming up with styles of draft that match their play. And I'm not saying like every team should go for team fighting comps. Granted, I think it'd be much simpler. A lot of these teams don't seem to be grasping the execution of a lot of the siege compositions or re-engage compositions properly. But some teams benefit and thrive off of some of these more complicated drafts, and that's totally fine. That makes sense in that particular playstyle. But if you don't match your playstyle to the draft that you're going for, if you're playing a draft that requires early game priority, and you're a team that doesn't do anything until like the 12 to 15 minute mark, then like what's the point, right? The last thing I think I'll come to with everything is there are no LPL games so far, and a lot of what's happening for me, at least, is still in the dark regarding what's going on, as they've already started their double elimination part of the bracket of their playoffs. I'll be able to get into it and probably very much catch up by the time next week's episode rolls around. But I'm wondering here, after seeing 4 finals, seeing 2 legacy regions and 2 emerging regions play at this point, the emerging regions need to figure out their play style and quick, and they need to seriously buckle down and become more consistent with some of their approaches. In the last 2-3 years, a lot of emerging regions surprise the legacy regions, right? They surprise especially North America, sometimes Korea, and the European teams will sometimes let loose. But like, this is a year where I don't think that might be the case, because of the prevalence of such strong team fighting is happening across the board for every region. I'd say with a notable exception of North America and North America, of like the LCS and the LCO being the only 2 regions that I think of that are not like notably strong in that particular category. The prevalence of the other 9 or the other 8 currently participating regions, because we haven't seen the VCS play at all, so I can't make a major assumption of that from their playoffs, has me worried that any other approach that they're still lacking on is not gonna cut it. And I'm a little concerned because the emerging regions so far have shown gradual improvement that really contest and push the legacy regions. And I don't think it's going to be the same kind of case this year at MSI, barring some strong changes to their game approach. But we still have 7 more finals left. So 7 more playoffs are still going to be active, of which 3 are from legacy regions and 4 from emerging regions. We'll see. Maybe something changes my mind. But at this moment, I'm a little concerned. What about you guys? What do you think? Leave comments down below from if any of this resonates, if there's some concerns you have, or if like one of the teams from one of your regions you're expecting good things out of them but are still concerned, or like you have no just super confidence it's not going to be a problem. What? Not a problem. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, especially your thoughts also on like the red side blue side debate and like some of the priorities in drafting. I'd love to know. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Everyone who watches all these videos, super appreciated. If you're new here, subscribe, like, comment, whole shebangle, all of that you want. And with that, I will see you next week.